Hello everyone, welcome to Easy Economics. How are you all doing? I hope you all are doing good. Today I brought for you all February March 2023 is IGCSE 0455 variant 22. We'll be doing data response, section A question. Let's see what this paper has brought for us today. Alright, I'll be reading the source material first and we'll be highlighting the key data. This case study is about US macroeconomic performance and it shed lights on its policies. It has given us the US fact file in the form of table first. It tells us that the current account of the balance of payment was a negative 470 billion. That means there was a deficit in its current account. Imports of goods and services were around 2,800 billion. Imports from China as a percentage of total imports was 20%. That means from its total imports, 20% of its imports were from China. Economic growth rate was a negative 2.8%. That means the economy was not growing, rather the economy was shrinking to approximately around 3%. Inflation rate hovered around 1.4%. Now they say that between 2009 and 2019, that means for a period of 10 years, US real GDP increased every year. This was a result, among other causes. So now they are giving us reasons why there was an increase in its real GDP. Real GDP is GDP that has already been accounted for inflation. That means the economy grew in its real terms, right? That means what were the reasons behind it? They say low interest rate, land reclamation, and an increase in the labor force. So these were the three prime reasons that contributed towards the growth in real GDP. All right. So these are the factors behind growth in real GDP. All right. What did they further say? The higher US output brought a number of benefits. Now they're saying always the GDP was increasing, but some workers lost their jobs. So now this is a negative point. This was because while some industries expanded, others closed down. Income also became more unevenly distributed. Income also became more unevenly distributed and pollution increased. So now they say there were multiple reasons. There were other industries expanded, some closed down. Income, there was a wide distribution, uneven distribution of income, and pollution was also there. So there were a number of factors that were negative, right? US exports and imports rose over this period. The growth of trade with China, a major trading partner of the US, was affected later in the period by increases in US tariffs on some Chinese imports. So now they're saying later it was that the imports from China were affected by the tariffs that were imposed. These increases were expected to change the US current account balance, output, and tax revenue. And it was assumed that the impact of tariffs would result in an impact on the US current account balance, the output, and the tax revenue the government will be generating. The US exports a range of products to China, including ice cream. So now US exports ice cream to China. China is the world's largest consumer of ice cream, buying a third of all ice cream consumed. So now of the world's ice cream, China is the world's largest consumer of ice cream and buys a third of the ice cream consumed. Chinese consumers sometimes buy chocolate to eat with ice cream. In 2019, the price of chocolate rose. So now you could say that chocolate is a complement to ice cream, right? In 2020, US macroeconomic performance changed. The country's price level rose more slowly, largely due to a decrease in consumer expenditure and a reduction in workers' bargaining power. So now they are saying that the inflation rate, the price level is what? It's the inflation rate. The inflation rate rose more slowly due to a decrease in consumer expenditure. That means consumer spending fell, and because there was a reduction in workers' bargaining power, right? The country's real GDP fell and unemployment rose. And what happened? The real GDP now fell and there was a rise in unemployment. These changes influenced US macroeconomic policy, and when obviously these changes occurred, so US had to alter its macroeconomic policies, and the US government spending rose significantly. So as a result, in order to combat rising unemployment, the government had to spend more. Now the government had to spend more on what? Let's say unemployment benefits, right? Or for the provision of certain goods and services in order to um, combat the effect. So now let's look at the statistics from 2015 to 2020. In 2015, the government spending was around 3,700 billion and the unemployment was 5.3%. Then the government spending was 3,900 and the unemployment was 4.9%. So the government spending, if you look at closely, the government spending kept on increasing and the unemployment rate kept on reducing. So from 5.3, it went to 4.9 to 4.4 to 3.9 to 3.7. And finally, in 2020, it was to $6,600 billion, but instead of unemployment falling, the unemployment rose. So this is the exception only. Otherwise, you can see that there is a inverse relationship. The higher the government spending, the lower the unemployment will be, except for 2020. The US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, announced in September 2010 that it would allow the inflation rate to rise and would not increase the interest rate. So now in 2010, it was allowed that let the inflation soar and the interest rate would not be increased. That means contractionary monetary policy would not be taken into consideration. In the past, central banks have aimed to keep the inflation rate low because of the effects that inflation can have on, for example, investment, exports, the distribution of income, and tax revenue. The Federal Reserve stated that it wanted to raise economic growth, which can increase income per head, employment, and tax revenue. So now the government said that it would not intervene by implementing contractionary monetary policy. Why? Because it wanted to raise economic growth, income per head, that means the GDP per capita or the GDP per head, employment level, and tax revenue. So in order to raise this, it did not wanted to implement any form of contractionary monetary policy, especially in the form of higher interest rates, just to combat the inflation rate. All right, that was the decision of the central bank. All right, hope so far it's clear. Let's look at the questions. All right. The first question, part A, asks us to calculate the value of US imports from China in 2020. It's a 1 mark thing. They are asking us to calculate. If we look closely, the first table showed us that imports of goods and services was around 2,800 billion and China's imports were around 20%, right? The US imports from China was 20%. So all I did was, now look at the left hand side, how I calculated it. I'll zoom it in for you. All right. So now if you look at closely, I've taken exactly these two figures, the imports of goods and the imports from China, right? So now what I've done is 20% of 2,800 billion, right? So 20% 2,800 billion would be 560 billion. So this is the value of US imports from China in 2020. Hope this is clear. You've shown that, straight 1 mark. All right. Part B says identify two causes of the increase in the quantity of US factors of production. So now you're going to identify any two reasons that contributed to the increase in factors of production. So now we found that earlier. Remember, it's the second line. They said that the real GDP rose each year. So what were the factors behind it? This was the result of, among other causes, there were low interest rates and land reclamation, right? So increase in labor force, land reclamation, again, these are the two reasons. You mentioned that and straight 2 marks awarded to you. All right. All right. Part C. Part C says explain one way that the import tariffs could improve US economy. Now this is a 2 mark question. So this means you need to identify one way. For identification, you'll get 1 mark and 1 mark would go for the explanation. So now they are saying tell us how import tariffs can improve US economy. So now what were imports? Imports are what? Uh, you are implementing it in order to curtail imports, right? So you want to improve what? The current account position. So the current account position was in a deficit scenario. So the reason why you imposed tariff was because you wanted to cut the government wanted to cut down on imports. So that's exactly the reason. So look at the left hand side. 1 mark would go for the identification, 1 mark would go for the explanation. So the first reason could be, if you're opting for this reason, you could say the tariffs would cause the current account balance to improve. How? Because it would raise the prices of imports. So now when the prices of imports would rise, the quantity of imports would fall, right? It would be expensive to import those goods and services. As a result, the balance of payment would improve. The current account scenario would improve. Or you could say that if the government is imposing tariffs, so the tax revenue for the government would rise. So when the tax revenue for the government would rise, the budget deficit would be in a favorable situation, right? The revenues for the government would increase, right? So this revenue that would be generated could be spent on, let's say, education, right? So any one of these reasons, you should select that, identify and explain, and you'll get full 2 marks. All right. So it's always wise to reread the question, because again, examiners say that candidates do not read the question and they go on explaining 2 reasons, right? So it wasn't 2 reasons, they just asked us for 1 reason. So 1 mark would be for the identification and the other would be for the explanation. All right. Part D. Part D says explain 2 reasons why the US inflation rate fell in 2020. So now you've got to identify and explain 2 reasons why the US inflation rate fell in 2020. Now, this is a 4 mark question. So, 1 mark would be for the explanation of 1 reason, 1 mark for the explanation of that reason, another mark for identification of the second reason, and for the explanation of that second reason, for 4 marks. All right. So, now 2 reasons why the US inflation rate fell in 2020. Here, we had identified that the country's price level rose more slowly. That means the inflation rate fell because there was a decrease in consumer expenditure and a reduction in workers' bargaining power, right? So again, we are seeing that there was a fall in consumer expenditure. That means the spending of consumers fell. So now when consumers are going to spend less, overall aggregate demand fell. So this means there was a fall in demandful inflation. Demandful inflation is what? Too much money chasing too few goods. So as a result, demandful inflation fell. So you link it to demandful inflation. You can also say that the workers' bargaining power fell. That means what? That means the pressure that was on wages fell. So you can link it to cost push inflation. This means that since the workers' bargaining power fell, uh, there was a less pressure on wages. So the workers could not pressurize the employers to give a rise in their wages. So as a result, the firms did not experience a rise in their cost of production. So as a result, there was a fall in cost push inflation, right? Or you could also say that since there was high unemployment, so the purchasing power of people or the purchasing power of employees had fallen. So as a result, they were spending less on goods and services. So again, when you are spending less on goods and services, so the price of goods and services are going to fall and the inflation level is going to fall. So demand pull inflation will fall. So you will link this rate of inflation to 2 ways. You link it to demand pull inflation and you link it to cost push inflation. So one reason you will attribute it to cost push inflation and the other you will link it to demand pull inflation. This is how we are going to address this question. All right. Hope it's clear. Part E. Part E asks us to draw a demand and a supply diagram to show the effect of an increase in the price of a complement on the market for ice cream. Now they are asking us to show how would the impact be reflected in a demand and a supply diagram to a product, to ice cream, if there has been an increase in the price of its complement. So over here, what was the complement of ice cream that we had identified? chocolates. So now let's suppose if there has been an increase in the price of chocolates, how do you think would there be an impact on the demand or the supply of ice cream? Now this is again a 4-mark question. You do not need to give any explanation. All you need to do is construct a proper demand and a supply diagram. How are the marks being allocated? Again, 1 mark for the correct construction of the horizontal and the vertical axis. 1 mark would go for the correct construction of the initial demand in the supply diagram. The 3rd mark would be given for the correct shift of the demand curve. The final 4th mark will be awarded once you've clearly identified the equilibrium position. So this is how full 4 marks will be awarded to you. I'll zoom in how I've constructed the demand and supply diagram to give you a fair idea of how you'll go about it. All right. So the vertical axis is displaying the price of ice cream. The horizontal is displaying the quantity of ice cream. This is the initial demand curve. This is the initial supply curve, and this is the initial equilibrium position. This was the price and this was the quantity. Now, when there was a rise in the price of a complement, let's say there was a rise in the price of chocolate, so the demand for ice cream would fall. So when the demand for ice cream is going to fall, there is going to be a shift in the demand curve. Now, recall, whenever there are other reasons behind the price itself, so the demand curve for that product shifts, right? So now when there is a rise in the price of a complement, the demand for the complement would fall. That product would fall. So now the entire demand curve is going to shift inwards towards the left. So the red curve shows the new demand curve, D1. As a result, the price fell from P to P1 and the quantity demanded fell from Q to Q1. You need not give an explanation, just show, and the equilibrium is now E1. So now you just show meet these 4 criteria, and full 4 marks will be awarded to you. Hope this is clear. All right, part F. Part F asks us to analyze the relationship between government spending and unemployment. This is a 5-mark question. Now, to answer this question, we need to look at this table. I'll zoom it in for you. All right. Now, like I identified earlier, we discussed earlier, from 2015 to 2020, as the government kept on increasing its spending, percentage of unemployment reduced, right? You can see from 5.3%, it fell to 4.9%, then to 4.4%, then to 3.9%. So it kept on falling. So the first thing you need to say is that there exists an inverse relationship or there exists a negative relationship. Or you could say that as the government spending kept on increasing, there was a fall in its unemployment rate. You've said that, the first mark will be awarded to you. Then you'll go about giving the evidence. How? You'll say from 2015 to 2019, as the government spending kept on increasing, the unemployment fell, the percentage of unemployment fell. Again, 1 mark would be awarded to you. Then you'll give an analysis of this relationship. You'll say the higher the government spending was, so as the government spending rose, the aggregate demand increased, firms expanded their output, so there were more and more workers were employed then. And when more and more workers were employed, this means that the rate of unemployment fell. And the government spending meant that the government was spending, let's say, more on infrastructure or providing training to the employees. And this enabled the workers to get employed. So now when the workers were employed, the unemployment percentage fell. So this is how you're going to give the explanation. That means, what do you mean by government spending? By government spending means training. Or by government spending means, let's say, availability of infrastructure. So the firms expanded their output, aggregate demand rose. So when more and more, the firms will be asking to recruit more and more workers. So as a result, the unemployment percentage fell, right? And then in turn, what will happen? Then when these workers are going to be employed, they will be paying taxes. So this means that more and more revenue will be generated for the government to spend even more. So this is the reason why the next year the government spending rose even more, right? Because as the workers kept on employing, they also contributed by way of direct and indirect taxes, and they provided a source for steady government revenue. All right. However, there exists an anomaly. However, there exists an exception. Now, what was the exception? Again, like I had identified earlier, that it was in 2020 that in spite of the fact that the government spending rose, unemployment percentage, instead of falling, rose. What could be the reason behind this exception? Now you're going to say that the government spending on unemployment benefits rose, or the government spending was not enough to prevent the GDP from falling. So you could say that although the government spending rose, but the government had to spend, let's say, more on unemployment benefits, or the government spending was not enough to prevent the GDP from falling. Any one of these two reasons, and again, full 5 marks will be awarded to you. Hope this part is clear to you. Part G. Part G is again a discuss question. This question is about 6 marks. It's asking us discuss whether or not a central bank should aim for a low inflation rate. So now they are asking us generally that whether or not a central bank should intervene or keep its prime objective to keep a low inflation rate. All right. So now a central bank, should it aim for a low inflation rate or not? So first, let's say, what is inflation? Inflation is a persistent rise in the general price level, right? So if a central bank aims for a low inflation rate, what would it do? If I say that yes, the central bank should aim for a low inflation rate, I would say that yes, if it aims for a low inflation rate, the exports. So for the first, I've said that inflation refers to the sustained increase in the price level, right? So if a central bank is aiming for a low inflation rate, it would be beneficial for the economy. Now, how it would be beneficial for the economy? That a low inflation rate could, firstly, it could reduce menu costs. What does by menu cost mean? That a firm would not have to change its prices so often, right? Then we could say that if the inflation rate is low, so this means that the balance of payment of a country would be affected. How? That exports would rise, and since the inflation rate would be low, so the exports would be price competitive, right? So when export prices of exports would be low, so the exports would rise in volume, and the exports are going to be competitive, and as a result, more and more of that country's goods will be demanded. So this means the employment level would also rise, right? Uh, so now when there had been a steady boost in the exports, so the firm would also get more and more foreign exchange. And when there will be a boost in the level of exports, so the standard of living of that country would increase. Overall aggregate demand would increase, and employment level would rise, and the country is going to experience economic growth. So the entire PPC is going to shift outwards, right? So the lower inflation rate is benefiting the balance of payment, as well as the domestic products would also be price competitive, right? So exports are going to rise and imports are going to fall. Moreover, there's going to be economic certainty, because when there is inflation rate is low, so investors are more willing to spend, and firms are more willing to expand, and are more willing to invest or increase their scales of operation, right? Um, so this boosts the overall economic activity, and aggregate demand overall is going to increase. So again, if the inflation rate is low, this could also mean that the firm's cost of production is going to fall. So the firms will have more money again to invest or to expand, right? So this could also mean that when they could also pass on their low cost of production in the form of lower prices to the general public. So the uh, lower sources of people who are earning would also be benefiting, right? Uh, and this would boost the purchasing power of people, and as a result, the standard of living is going to rise overall the economy, right? Even those who are earning lower income. However, we could also say that if the central bank aims for a lower rate of inflation, it might not be beneficial. Why? Because let's say a fall in inflation can lead to deflation, or it could even lead to recession, right? Because the central bank would be using what? The central bank would be using contractionary monetary policy. That means either it would be raising interest rates or either it would be curtailing money supply. So, in order to reduce the level of inflation, if the government increases, the central bank increases the interest rates, so what will happen? The investment will fall, right? And overall, the aggregate demand would fall. Consumers, so it would discourage investment and it would discourage consumer expenditure as well. And this means then when the consumer expenditure is going to fall, so the firm's demand for goods and services would fall. So the firms would get out of business, and it might be that the firm might shut down, they might lay off workers. So as a result, unemployment level will rise, and there also could be, it could lead to cyclical unemployment, which is demand deficient unemployment. It could be even the economy could be in a dangerous situation, right? So this means economic growth would fall, right? So when economic growth is going to fall, so the lower output would cause, let's say, cyclical unemployment, demand deficient unemployment, and the standard of living of a country is going to fall, economic growth rate is going to fall, the productive capacity, the productive potential of the economy is going to fall, the economy is going to shrink inwards, right? And the living standards is going to fall. So there would be a decrease in the country's living standards, right? So the decision of whether or not a central bank should aim for a low inflation rate would depend upon if the merits outweigh the disadvantages, right? It must not lead to cyclical unemployment or cause the economy to go into a recession. That would be a dangerous scenario. All right, part H. Part H says discuss whether or not economic growth benefits everyone in the US. Now, this is a little tricky question in the sense that it's asking us whether or not economic growth benefits everyone in the US. So now they're particularly talking about the US economy, and they are saying that it is, will it be beneficial for everybody in the economy, right? So let's say, if we can say that economic growth can benefit everyone in the US economy as if it is an increase in the productive capacity of the country over time, right? So if its economic growth is what? The increase in the productive potential of the economy, right? So this means what? This means that the entire PPC shifts outwards, right? So if there is an increase in the productive capacity of the country over time, so this means that the output level is going to rise. This means that the GDP is going to rise, right? This means that economic growth will lead to an increase in the incomes, right? Which means the GDP per head is also increasing. And this means that the purchasing power of people is going to rise. So when people are going to be earning more and more income, they're going to spend more. As a result, the standard of living is going to rise. So when the standard of living is going to rise, people are going to be spending more and more on goods and services. The government is going to generate more and more revenue by way of both indirect and direct sources of taxes, right? So this means that the government would have more revenue to spend on infrastructure, or let's say reducing unemployment. So this means when there would be a fall in unemployment, so overall the employment level would rise. So when the employment level would rise, more and more people are going to be employed. So overall the poverty level of the US economy is going to fall. And this means that there could be even better working conditions then, right? And however, we could say that it might not be beneficial. Why? Because it could lead to unequal distribution of income, right? Because economic growth can, let's say, lead to demand pull inflation, because when people are going to witness an increase in their GDP per head, so they are going to be spending more and more on goods and services. So there could be too much money chasing too few goods. So it could lead to, firstly, it could lead to demand pull inflation. So when it would lead to demand pull inflation, it could raise the price of the basic necessities, right? So those who are on low income, it might not be beneficial for them. Or we could also say that economic growth would then widen the gap between the rich and the poor. So it could lead to a disparity among incomes. It could widen the gap, between the rich and the poor, so it could aggravate the situation of unequal distribution of income. Again, if you are expanding the economy at a rate faster than your resources could be recouped, this means you would give rise to a negative externality, or you could lead to depletion of some scarce resources. There could be a rise in the level of pollution level. And again, if you are concentrating on economic growth, it means some industries might be rising, some might be collapsing. And it could also be possible that unemployment could occur if you are relying more on capital intensive methods of production. So it means that labor could be laid off. And if you're relying more on capital intensive methods, it could lead to structural unemployment. So then it might not be beneficial for the economy. Or it could also not be beneficial if you are devoting more and more resources for in the production of capital goods. So this means uh, if you're concentrating more on the production of capital goods, so the benefits might not be reaped at that time only, right? All right. So again, economic growth would be beneficial, not for everyone in the economy. It depends on how the merits are shared. So as long as there does not exist a disparity or it does not widen the gap, income distribution gap, it's beneficial, or it does not lead to depletion of resources, or does not aggregates external costs. All right. The trick was that it benefits everyone. So this is how you're going to answer the question. All right. I hope you enjoyed solving this paper with me and you found it useful. Stay tuned, subscribe, and do let me know through your feedback. How did you find this paper solving with me?